At noon, the sky should have been at its brightest. Jesus was hanging on the cross. People were mocking him. Religious leaders were watching. Roman soldiers were standing nearby. Then the light disappeared. Matthew says, darkness came over the land from the 6th hour until the 9th, about noon until about 3 in the afternoon. 3 hours. Not a few seconds. Not darkness after sunset. Darkness in the middle of the day. And then, near the end of those 3 hours, Jesus cries, my God, why have you forsaken me? Soon after, he dies. So why does the Gospel slow down and tell us exactly how long the darkness lasted? Why noon? Why 3 hours? And why does darkness surround the cross at the very moment Christians believe God is accomplishing salvation? The answer is not hidden in numerology. The Gospels never tell us to decode the number 3 here. But they do something much more interesting. They place the darkness inside a pattern that runs through the Old Testament. Darkness, judgment, mourning, and the day of the Lord. Then they place Jesus in the middle of it. That changes the entire scene. Start with Matthew. Jesus has already been crucified. His clothes have been divided. People passing by insult him. The chief priests mock him. Even those crucified beside him join in. Everything looks public, visible, humiliating. Then Matthew suddenly says, now from the 6th hour there was darkness over all the land, until the 9th hour. No explanation, no dramatic speech announcing it. Darkness simply arrives, and the timing matters. The 6th hour is around noon. This is not ordinary evening darkness. It comes when the sun should dominate the sky. That immediately gives the scene a biblical feeling. Because when darkness appears in Scripture at the wrong time, it often means something is wrong at a much deeper level. One of the strongest examples appears in the prophet Amos. God says, on that day I will make the sun go down at noon and darken the earth in broad daylight. Noon, darkness, broad daylight. Then Amos continues with language of mourning. I will make it like the mourning for an only son. That does not prove Matthew is saying. This is the exact fulfillment of Amos chapter 8. Matthew does not stop and quote Amos, but the resonance is difficult to ignore. A prophet speaks of darkness at noon, mourning like the loss of an only son. And centuries later the Gospels describe darkness beginning around noon while Jesus the Son is dying. That is not the kind of detail a Bible reader should rush past. And Amos gives us the first major clue. Darkness is not simply there to make the crucifixion look frightening. It is associated with judgment. Something is happening that the darkness interprets. The cross looks like Rome judging Jesus. The darkness suggests the scene is much bigger than Rome. Human beings think they are putting Jesus on trial. The sky begins to look as though the world itself has entered judgment. That raises a harder question. Who is being judged? Because biblical darkness is usually bad news. It is connected with disaster, wrath, the day of the Lord, the overthrow of human pride. But here the darkness does not fall over a battlefield. It falls while Jesus is hanging on a cross. And Jesus is the one the Gospels have repeatedly presented as innocent. Pilate struggles to find guilt deserving death. The thief in Luke says Jesus has done nothing wrong. The centurion will soon respond to what happens at the cross with a declaration about Jesus. So why does the imagery of judgment surround the innocent one? That question takes us deeper into what the New Testament thinks the cross means. But before we answer it, there is another Old Testament scene we need to notice. Egypt. Before the first Passover, a plague of darkness covers the land. Exodus describes darkness that can be felt. Then comes the death of the firstborn. Then Passover. Then deliverance. Now look at the crucifixion. Jesus dies during Passover season. Darkness falls. Death comes. Deliverance is being accomplished. Again, we should be careful. The Gospels do not say the 3 hours of darkness are the 9th plague repeated, and the details are not identical. Exodus has darkness for 3 days. The crucifixion has darkness for 3 hours. We do not need to force the stories into a perfect code, but the echo belongs in the background. The Bible already has a vocabulary in which darkness, Passover, judgment, death, and deliverance can appear together. At the cross, those themes collide around Jesus, and this is where something remarkable happens. In Exodus, darkness falls on Egypt. At Calvary, darkness falls while Israel's Messiah is hanging under Roman execution. The categories are no longer simple. This is not, bad people over there receive darkness. The darkness surrounds the place where the righteous Jesus suffers. The cross takes the language of judgment and puts it in a location nobody expected. That is why the next words of Jesus matter so much. Matthew says that around the 9th hour, Jesus cries with a loud voice, Eli, Eli, lema sabachthani. My God, why have you forsaken me? The darkness has lasted for hours. Then this cry breaks through it, and Jesus is quoting the opening line of Psalm 22. That psalm begins in abandonment. My God, why have you forsaken me? But it does not remain there. The psalm describes mockery, people shaking their heads, enemies surrounding the sufferer, garments being divided. Then later, the psalm turns toward vindication, praise, deliverance, the nations turning toward God. So Jesus' cry is not random. The people standing beneath the cross are watching details that sound painfully close to the psalm Jesus is invoking. But we should not flatten the moment into Jesus was only quoting scripture and did not actually feel abandoned. The cry is real. The suffering is real. The darkness is real. Jesus does not recite the psalm like a classroom exercise. He cries it from a cross. At the same time, Psalm 22 means the cry does not have to be interpreted as Jesus suddenly ceasing to be the Son or the Trinity somehow breaking apart. The Gospel does not say that. Jesus still says, my God. The lament comes from within relationship. It is the language of terrible suffering, not proof that God has ceased to be God or the Son has ceased to be the Son. And now the 3 hours become even more powerful. The darkness creates a long space around this suffering. Imagine if Matthew had said, a strange shadow passed over the hill. It lasted a moment, then it was gone. The scene would feel completely different. Instead, the darkness stays, minute after minute, then another, then another. The crucifixion continues inside it. 3 hours is long enough that nobody standing there could treat it like a blink. The gospel gives the darkness duration, weight, presence. The sky does not simply flicker. The scene is held in darkness, and the Gospels connect the end of that period with Jesus' final suffering and death. That does not mean the number 3 itself contains a secret code. Scripture often uses numbers meaningfully, but here the text does not explain the 3 hours symbolically. The safest and strongest point is simpler. The darkness is sustained, public, timed, and attached directly to the final phase of the crucifixion. It begins at noon. It ends around the time Jesus dies. The darkness becomes a frame around the most intense part of the cross. That is probably more important than trying to invent hidden arithmetic. But could this simply have been an eclipse? People have tried to explain it that way for a very long time. The problem is that the Gospels are not interested in giving us a scientific report. They describe the event as part of the theological meaning of the crucifixion. Luke says the sun's light failed or was obscured, depending on how the wording is rendered and the manuscript tradition involved. Matthew and Mark simply emphasize darkness over the land. Whatever physical mechanism may have been involved, the Gospel writers want us to read the darkness as part of what the cross means. That is the point, because immediately after the darkness, the story accelerates. Jesus cries out. Jesus dies. The temple veil tears from top to bottom. The earth shakes in Matthew, tombs open, and a Roman centurion reacts. Everything around Jesus' death begins to say, this is not an ordinary execution. Rome has crucified thousands of people. The Gospels do not describe the sky going dark for every one of them. Something about this death is different, and the centurion sees enough to respond. Matthew records him saying, truly this was the Son of God. Now think about the irony. For hours, Jesus has been mocked because of his identity. If you are the Son of God, let God deliver him. He saved others. He cannot save himself. Then darkness falls. Jesus dies. The earth reacts. The veil tears. And a Roman soldier looks at the man, everyone mocked, and says, Son of God. The darkness helps reverse the interpretation of the scene. At first, Jesus looks defeated. By the end, the people who thought they were watching a failed Messiah have witnessed something the Gospel treats as cosmic. That is one reason darkness is such a powerful symbol here. Light normally reveals. darkness hides. Yet at Calvary, the darkness actually reveals what the crowd cannot see. They see a condemned man. The gospel sees judgment. They see weakness. The gospel sees the Son completing his mission. They see Rome exercising power. The gospel sees something happening between God, sin, death, and humanity that Rome does not understand. The darkness says, do not judge this event by appearance alone. If Bible details like this are why you keep coming back to Scripture, subscribe. The smallest details often become the doorway into the biggest questions. Now we can return to the question we left open. If darkness represents judgment, why does it surround Jesus? The New Testament's answer is not contained in one metaphor. It speaks about the cross in several ways: sacrifice, ransom, reconciliation, victory, atonement, bearing sin. Jesus gives his life for others. Paul says God made Christ, who knew no sin, to be sin for us, so that in him we might become the righteousness of God. Peter says Christ suffered for sins, the righteous for the unrighteous, that he might bring us to God. Isaiah had already described the servant as wounded for the transgressions of others. So when darkness falls around the cross, Christians have long understood it naturally within that larger biblical picture of judgment and sin. But we should say this carefully. Matthew does not pause and say, the darkness means precisely this one thing. Biblical symbols can carry several connected meanings at once: judgment, mourning, cosmic disturbance, the day of the Lord, the horror of what is happening, the significance of Jesus' death. Trying to reduce it to one sentence may actually make the scene smaller. The darkness does not need to be a single word code. It is an atmosphere built out of the Bible's deepest judgment imagery, and there is another Old Testament theme underneath it: the day of the Lord. Prophets repeatedly describe that day with darkness. Joel speaks of a day of darkness and gloom. Zephaniah speaks of darkness and thick darkness. The prophets use cosmic language when God acts decisively in judgment. At Calvary, that kind of imagery gathers around Jesus, but here is the reversal. Many people expected the day of the Lord to mean God crushing Israel's enemies. Instead, darkness arrives while Israel's Messiah is being crucified. That is shocking. The cross overturns simple expectations about how divine victory should look. God's decisive act does not first appear as a warrior destroying Rome. It appears as Jesus refusing to come down from the cross. The people mock him for that. He saved others. He cannot save himself. But the gospel's logic is exactly the opposite. He does not save himself because he is giving himself. That is why the mockery is so ironic. They think inability is keeping him on the cross. The gospel presents obedience. They think darkness means chaos. The gospel presents the moment around which salvation is being accomplished. And this brings us back to the length of the darkness. Why 3 hours? The most honest answer is, the Gospels tell us the duration, but they do not explicitly tell us that the number 3 itself has a separate symbolic meaning. That matters. We do not need to make up a mystery when the real one is already strong enough. The darkness begins around noon. The brightest part of the day becomes dark. It remains through the final phase of Jesus' suffering. Then, around the 9th hour, Jesus cries the words of Psalm 22. Soon after, he dies. So the 3 hours give the darkness structure: beginning, duration, end. It surrounds the climax of the crucifixion. And because the Gospels specify the time, the reader cannot dismiss it as a vague poetic statement. They want us to notice something changed in the middle of the day, and it stayed changed. There is one more contrast worth seeing. When Jesus is born, Luke describes glory and light surrounding shepherds in the night. At his death, darkness covers the day. Night receives light. Day receives darkness. Again, the Gospels do not tell us to turn that into a formal symbolic equation, but the contrast fits the larger story beautifully. Jesus enters a dark world as light. Then at the cross, darkness gathers around him. John's Gospel will repeatedly speak about light and darkness. People love darkness rather than light. Jesus called himself the light of the world. Yet here, in the synoptic crucifixion accounts, the light appears swallowed by darkness for 3 hours. Then he dies. If the story ended there, darkness would win. But Christianity exists because the story does not end there. The darkness at the cross is real. The death is real. The burial is real. Then comes morning. That is why Christians should not read the 3 hours as a standalone horror scene. They belong inside a larger movement. Darkness, death, burial, then resurrection. The cross goes through darkness. It does not remain there. And that changes the emotional meaning of the scene, because the darkness does not mean Jesus has lost control. Earlier in the Gospel, he predicted his death. He predicted his resurrection. He entered Jerusalem knowing what was coming. He told his disciples the Son of Man would be handed over and killed. The darkness is terrible, but it is not unexpected by Jesus. That is important. The crowd sees disaster. Jesus is walking the road he has already described. Even his cry from the cross reaches back into Scripture. Nothing about the scene is casual. The mockery, the divided garments, the darkness, the cry, the death, the torn veil, the centurion. Piece after piece asks the same question, who is this man? And the darkness makes that question impossible to keep small. So why did darkness last 3 hours while Jesus was on the cross? Not because the Bible gives us a secret numerical code. Not because Matthew wants us calculating hidden meanings from the number 3. The text gives us something much more powerful. Darkness comes at noon, the kind of imagery the prophets associated with judgment and the day of the Lord. It surrounds the death of the innocent Messiah. It lasts through the final hours of his suffering. It leads into the cry of Psalm 22. And it ends near the moment Jesus dies and the signs surrounding his death explode into view. The darkness tells the reader, this is not merely Rome executing another prisoner. Something much larger is happening. Judgment is in the air. Mourning is in the air. Passover is in the background. The language of the prophets is coming alive. And at the center of all of it hangs Jesus. For 3 hours, the brightest part of the day becomes dark. Then the darkness ends. But the man on the cross dies, and that is the final shock. The light returns before Jesus does. For anyone standing there, the story still looks finished. The tomb is still ahead. Silence is still ahead. The disciples will still scatter. But the gospel reader knows something. The people beneath the cross do not yet know. Darkness gets 3 hours. The grave gets days. Neither gets Jesus forever.